So that should capture everything we say and do for the next period of time. As we're in this presentation, and I see most people have done it already, but there will be several breaks during the presentation for question and answer period. So if you could mute your lines until you want to ask a question during those times, that would be great to cut down on background noise. I'll be getting rid of my fan sound in a little bit here. Like I said, we are recording this meeting, and I would also suggest that for tonight's presentation, to keep questions more towards like clarifications or big topics, we are accepting written comments where you can give more details or specifics on the document as it's presented through the documents that are posted on our website, which give a table for providing feedback on the different sections, just so we don't get too far into the weeds on anything tonight. But you can also reach out to me with questions that are detailed, but definitely we want things in writing so we can incorporate that feedback and suggested changes and capture it in the final document. And I know that there's been a ton of stakeholders that have been involved in this project, and I do want to first of all thank NRCS for providing the funding for this project. It's been a great way for us to get plugged into the watershed and meeting the different groups in the watershed. So that's been really great to do this project and get this accomplished and move forward with improving water quality in the Farm River. And there is a ton of groups that have been involved in the stakeholder meetings over the past 2 years. I did write them all down. I hesitate to start saying them because I know I'll forget somebody, but I think that might save some time. So I'm going to take a stab at it, and if I forget your group, I totally apologize up front. And the other thing you can do after I say those, if you want to just do an intro in the chat box of who you are and the organization you're with, then we will also capture that as part of the meeting. But throughout this process, we've worked with the municipal staff in the town, so Brantford, North Brantford, Guilford, East Haven, Wallingford, they've all been involved. The land trusts in the area, North Brantford Land Trust, Brantford Land Trust, East Haven Land Trust. DEP has been involved, EPA has been involved, Save the Sound, Trout Unlimited, the Regional Water Authority, Friends of the Farm River have been involved. The East Shore Health District have had staff at these meetings. So I've definitely listed the ones I wrote down. So if I didn't mention your group, I do apologize up front. And at this point, I would also just like to just acknowledge, we do have one VIP that I'll call out attention to is the state rep for the area, Robin Comey, is attending the meeting tonight. So just wanted to call attention to her for being here, and thank you for coming, Robin. I'm glad that you're here to learn about the issues in the Farm River watershed and what we can do to improve the water quality there. I think that's all I've got at this point. So I'm going to turn it over to Michael Soares and Eric Moss from Fuss and O'Neill. I'm going to mute my line, but if folks do want to just type in the chat function your name and the group that you're with, it'd be great to start doing that now. And Michael, you should be able to share your screen.
Thanks, Chris. Let's see, make sure. Is everybody seeing the presentation right now?
Looks good.
Looks good.
Okay. My name is Michael Soares, but actually we're going to start with my colleague, Eric. Eric, do you want to take it off?
Sure, yeah. So Mike will control the slides, and I'll just tell you when I'm ready for the next slide. Welcome, everyone. My name is Eric Moss. Again, Michael and I have been working with Chris and the stakeholders now over the past year and a half on this plan. And we're excited to present the recommendations tonight, is the draft recommendations, and get some feedback from the stakeholders and members of the public who may have not have been involved along the way. So Michael, go to the next slide and So we are here tonight, basically, we're going to try to do four things. We're going to describe the watershed planning process, provide a high-level overview summary of the watershed conditions and issues, many of which some of the stakeholders have already have seen and are aware of. We're going to present the draft recommendations of the plan, and then most importantly, we're seeking additional community input so we can finalize the plan over the next few weeks. And we're hoping to get some good questions and comments. Again, not looking for super detailed comments in tonight's meeting, but giving you the opportunity to maybe perhaps in writing, provide some more detailed comments over the next few weeks. Next slide.
Sorry, Eric, are you seeing the full slide or the note slide?
I see the full screen version.
Great, just
Yep.
checking. Thank you.
Let's go to the next. Okay. So Chris already mentioned all of the stakeholders that have been involved in the project, including the project steering committee and partners. Again, mentioning that the funding source has been primarily the NRCS, the USDA NRCS National Water Quality Initiative Grant, as well as local funding through the Conservation District and also Regional Water Authority. Next slide, please. So a little bit of background again, as a reminder for everyone where this project, how it originated. There was a source water protection plan that was prepared for the Farm River watershed back in 2011. And source water refers to drinking water. So the groundwater and the surface water that provides drinking water to folks in the watershed. In 2018, the Farm River was selected by NRCS for a nationwide pilot project through this water quality initiative program. And from that, one of the tasks is to develop a multi-objective watershed plan. So a watershed plan that addresses runoff and water quality issues originating from urban and suburban land uses, and also from agricultural land uses, as well as protecting drinking water supplies in the watershed and the downstream water quality in Long Island Sound. Next slide, please.
All the vegetables I have.
And if anyone hasn't muted themselves, you could please just mute your microphone. Appreciate that, thanks. So the goals of the project, really the watershed planning goals for the watershed are first and foremost to address what are called impaired waters. So address the degraded water quality in the watershed to return those to either swimmable or fishable conditions in the watershed. I also mentioned that another focus is to protect high quality waters and drinking water supplies. You'll see that about 3/4 of the land area in the watershed contributes to those drinking water supplies. Again, I mentioned that we're also looking to reduce the downstream water quality impacts to Long Island Sound, especially in terms of nutrients that are being contributed to the dissolved oxygen issues in Long Island Sound and the embayments. We're looking to address, again, sort of the wide variety of land uses in the watershed, from urban and suburban land uses to agricultural and the non-point source pollution that arises from these land uses. And then we're looking to identify really measures that provide not only water quality benefits, but will also benefit habitat and also climate resilience, topics that are related to, obviously, to water quality. Next slide. So in terms of our scope and how we went about developing a watershed plan, this slide shows the major tasks in our project. We're looking at evaluating existing watershed conditions, which we did last year and was the subject of a stakeholder workshop we had about a year ago now. We had, again, that stakeholder meeting to kind of get some more input from the stakeholders. After that, last fall, we conducted field assessments that Michael will describe a little bit more. We did some pollutant load modeling of the watershed, looking at different sources of different types of pollutants that are contributing to some of the water quality issues. And then we got into identifying potential management measures that make sense for the watershed, and then wrap these up into the draft watershed plan, or the sections that we've made available so far with those draft recommendations. We're having our presentation tonight to get feedback from folks as part of the review of the draft plan. And then we're looking to move over the next few weeks to finalizing the watershed plan recommendations. And I will say that this watershed planning process is somewhat unique in that it's addressing both the EPA requirements for watershed management plans, as well as the NRCS watershed plan requirements under that National Water Quality Initiative. And having this plan in place will essentially set up the watershed in good shape for funding and technical assistance through both the EPA funding sources like 319 9-point source grant funding, as well as the NRCS financial and technical assistance programs. So again, I think everyone already knows, a lot about watersheds here, but, what is a watershed? Basically, why are we looking at watersheds? Watersheds provide really a good framework for addressing water resources issues, including water quality problems. The watershed is that land area that drains to, a point on a river, a lake, an estuary, the coastline. And watersheds, of course, they cross municipal boundaries. So, the water doesn't care, where it originates from, if it crosses from one town to another. And basically, it kind of consolidates, all of the land use activities in the watershed. And what we see in terms of water quality impacts are because of those land use activities, development, agriculture, stormwater runoff, everyday activities that affect, water quality. So really the most, the best way to address water quality problems or issues and to protect, water resources is using this watershed framework and really working together between communities that share the watershed. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Michael now to talk about current conditions.
Hi, everybody. My name, again, is Michael Soares. I'm a wetland scientist with Fuss & O'Neill and also work on a lot of other water and climate-related projects in our Water and Natural Resources group. We went through this current conditions review in the initial stakeholder meeting, but we're just going to acclimate some people who weren't at that first meeting, just to kind of give context as we go further into our discussion of recommendations and the analysis. So it's a 25.5 square mile sub-regional basin. It's 7 towns. Really, the majority of the watershed, a little bit over 90% of the watershed is in East Haven, Brantford, and North Brantford, and then a fair bit in Wallingford, and then just kind of a handful of acres in Guilford and North Haven and Durham. So most of the town really is comprised, most of the watershed rather is really comprised in those 3 towns and then into Wallingford. It has this is showing us the 16 local basins that comprise the whole watershed. The 2 maps here you're seeing are representing the same thing, which is the Farm River subwatershed. In this map here, it is sort of shaded through the center, and you can see how the tributaries, some named, some not, are feeding in pretty much from the east and the west side. It's an slightly unusual or unique shape to a watershed. It's very narrow, and so the main stem, being the Farm River, doesn't have a lot of buffer, so to speak, from where the tributaries might be contributing stormwater or pollutants. It's a fairly short trip from the side tributaries into the main stem of the Farm River. What we can see here is a bit of the source water areas. So 73%, the areas shaded in blue, are the subwatersheds that contribute to regional water authorities' public water supplies. So they own about 9% of the land in the watershed, which we will see in many different versions as we go through their current conditions. But about 73% of the watershed actually contributes to those water supplies. Lake Saltonstall is in the watershed and is approximately 10% of the supply. Lake Gillard is outside and is a much larger supply, but there is a bit of an exchange that they can operate depending on their supply needs between the 2 as well. There are a number of diversions in the watershed that are operated by Regional Water Authority. There is also a small municipal water supply coming out of the town of Wallingford from Pistapog Pond. Those customers are outside of the Farm River watershed, but that's about a 136-acre reservoir that's operated by the Water and Sewer Division in the town of Wallingford. It's mostly disconnected from the Farm River. It doesn't tend to really flow down into it, but when the water is high enough, it does contribute water to the Farm River watershed. And then in addition, of course, we have private and small community groundwater resources through private wells. So just to look at some of the things that can influence water impairment and water quality, one way to look at that is through land use records or land use categories. These land uses have been taken from parcel data rather. And so just the overarching picture here for the Farm River watershed is we have about 42% is considered residential land use, and 27% is the open space. And there are other categories here, but those are sort of the driving land use categories. It's important to note in this set of data, we have about 22% that isn't really classified yet. So that's just where we have some gap in this parcel data. We can look at what Yukon Clear has done since 1985 in terms of providing a much more higher resolution, looking at land cover, which is sort of a substitute for the land use through the parcels. And again, we're seeing a lot of the development covers not so much what the parcel is, but what the actual it's a 30 meter square pixel that they then classify. And so that's a much higher resolution than looking at just the parcels in town and how they've been categorized. And so overall, we end up with about 35% being developed turf and grass. If you add some utility and barren areas, it's more around 40%. Forest is also just over 40%, and agriculture, as you can see, the brown agricultural fields through the North Brantford and farther north are at 9%. These are kind of the driving land covers in terms of water quality, development, agriculture, and forest. So it's helpful just to see how they're distributed. It's pretty easy to see when they're separate like this that the distribution is not really throughout the watershed, but we have concentrations of development to the south. And then as we get into the central and northern parts of the watershed, it's these residentially dense areas. Agriculture is fairly well distributed throughout the central and north. Some watersheds have a higher concentration than others. And then you can see in the forest, the really large contiguous blocks of forest are those lands that are the source water protection areas that the regional water supply operates and maintains as open space. And just to kind of focus out a little bit more on our interests, Yukon has also done a riparian corridor land cover. This is a 300-foot wide buffer around streams and rivers across the state. And so here in the Farm River watershed, we see the same breakdown roughly in our major categories. 50% forested in the riparian cover throughout the watershed. That includes the source water protection areas of RWA. So I would say if we took those out, that 50% would probably drop to 40 or 45. Our development in our riparian corridors is at 35%, and agricultural fields is at 11%. And just to back up a little bit, the focus on riparian corridors is mainly to really focus on the areas where runoff and can be getting into rivers and streams and lakes, water bodies, just through surface runoff. And so we have buffers that are more naturally vegetated that just provides greater protection and improvement of water quality. Another way we can look at this is with impervious cover. Basically, roughly south of Foxen Road, we have much higher levels of impervious cover. Impervious cover is parking lots, buildings, anything that's not going to allow precipitation to infiltrate into the soil where it can be retained and slowly either move as groundwater or just slowly be used by plants, or just not directly get into a water body and carry pollutants into the water body. You can see that the areas that have the source water protection lands operated by RWA pretty much have the lowest levels of impervious cover. The 11% here is sort of a threshold point where it's correlated pretty well, that impacts to water quality. That's sort of the point of impervious cover where you have chronic impacts to water quality at that 11%. So we have anything in yellow or red is above that 11%. So those are areas to, I guess, to kind of focus recommended actions, watershed-wide or site-specific projects could be more effective in these places where you have this impervious cover over 11%. And just to talk about Farm River for a second, it's one main local drainage area. This analysis broke it up into 21 segments, which is helpful because it changes a lot from north to south. And so in the north, it's quite rural in places. When you get in your Lake Salton Stall south, it's quite developed. And so overall, it's about an average of a 10.6 impervious cover for the Farm River Watershed's local basin. Many of those, about 11, or 7 of them rather, are over 11, and they do get up as high as 21%. So there's some way to look at the whole stem of the Farm River and be selective in implementing projects or outreach in terms of improving water quality. That just is taking a chance for us to have any questions related on those first 2 sections. We'll have a few more breaks going forward on different pieces. Anybody have questions about what Eric reviewed on the watershed planning process or the current conditions? No?
There's nothing in the chat either, Michael, so.
Okay. Eric, I think it's over to you now.
Yep, that sounds good. All right, so now that we've talked about some of the current conditions, impervious cover, and some of the land use and land cover, what are the water quality issues that we're trying to address? So these break down into both surface water and also groundwater. And in terms of surface water, there are several water quality issues in terms of degraded or impaired water quality. The first is related to elevated levels of fecal indicator bacteria, and this typically results in an impairment for recreation. So we have bacterial levels in portions of the Farm River that are too high to support recreation, whether it's swimming or non-swimming recreation. And sources of bacteria can be numerous things such as stormwater runoff, failing septic systems, wildlife, pet waste, agricultural activities involving livestock. So a number of potential sources in this very diverse watershed. The other issues are related to excess nutrients. So in this case, those are driven by nitrogen, this being a coastal watershed. And we see that there are excess nutrients or nitrogen levels in the estuary portion of the Farm River, the lower portion of the Farm River, and the embayment next to Long Island Sound. Excess phosphorus can also have issues for inland surface waters like reservoir water quality, with too much phosphorus leading to the process of eutrophication and algae blooms, low dissolved oxygen in these water bodies. So there are a set of inland issues dealing with phosphorus typically, and then the coastal issues dealing with nitrogen more commonly. There's also what's referred to as aquatic life use support. So whether it's because of chemical levels of pollutants or lack of flow, certain segments of streams in the watershed don't support healthy populations of either insects or other aquatic life like fish. And there are a few examples of segments in the river that don't support aquatic life, given levels of stormwater runoff or other undesignated sources of either pollutants or low flow issues. And then I mentioned, these downstream impacts to the estuary and ultimately Long Island Sound. The water quality in the Farm River, is linked to the water quality in the coastal embayment and the Sound itself, like many of the other coastal watersheds in Connecticut. On the groundwater side, we have to be concerned about contamination to public and private water supply wells that Michael mentioned. There are areas that are supplied by wells and private and public wells, And these are susceptible to contamination, again, by a whole host of chemicals kind of in the developed landscape, nitrogen, nitrate, sodium, chloride from de-icing practices in the winter, and also pathogens. The same kind of bacteria can also impact groundwater supplies. So on the next slide, we have a map that summarizes these impaired waters. And again, by impaired waters, we mean waters that don't currently meet water quality standards for these certain designated uses, whether it's recreation, aquatic life, in some cases, fish consumption in shellfish growing areas, or for drinking water supplies in this watershed. And these are all based on the latest Connecticut Deep, it's called the 2020 Integrated Water Quality Report. It's their latest assessment of surface water quality throughout the state. So as you can see in the yellow, we pointed out those impaired segments of the Farm River and its tributaries. And starting at the segment in the northern section of the watershed in North Branford, we've got a segment that's impacted for aquatic life use support. Again, this is due to low flows, likely related to some of the diversions and the lack of recharge of the streams in this part of the watershed. Similarly, on Gulf Brook, it's in that regional water authority, drinking water supply area, but it also has issues in terms of low flow and aquatic life support. As we move downstream on the main stem of the Farm River, we come to the first impaired segment that's impaired for elevated bacteria, and that starts just below Page's Mill Pond Dam area. So there's a reach right before, from about that location down to Burrs Brook, that is impaired for recreation, aquatic life use, and also for drinking water, interestingly. So there's multiple issues going on there. And then Burrs Brook, similarly, that comes in, originates around the Tillicon Quarry area, and that is also impaired for aquatic life use, I believe due to sediment. And then the rest of the main stem of the Farm River, from that point all the way down to the estuary portion, is impaired, again, for elevated bacteria, recreation, and then aquatic life use. You can imagine that, in this area, it's more highly developed. There's more stormwater runoff, so different sources necessarily than the middle and northern sections. But again, the similar issues with elevated bacteria levels. And then I mentioned the estuary and then the embayment are impaired for aquatic life use, again, primarily to elevated nitrogen levels coming from the watershed itself. So this kind of rounds out, a snapshot of the water quality issues that we're trying to address in terms of, those degraded or impaired waters. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we conducted some pollutant load modeling. One of the requirements of the EPA watershed plan framework is to estimate pollutant loads that are coming from the land surface and land use activities in the watershed, and then calculate what the reductions in those loads might be given implementation of certain recommendations in the watershed plan. So as part of this, we did some pollutant load modeling, very high level screening level modeling of annual loads of bacteria, nutrients, and sediment to the surface waters in the watershed. And we considered both land use and then secondary sources, things like point sources, septic systems, livestock, things that are kind of more land use activities on top of the land uses themselves. And we used a model that's been widely used for these kinds of applications. It's called the watershed treatment model, and it's been around and used widely for watershed planning and similar types of water quality projects. So on the next slide, we have just a brief kind of a snapshot of the various model inputs. And I won't go into detail on a lot of these inputs, but essentially there are things like land use, impervious cover, rainfall, soils, and then information on things like those secondary sources I mentioned, septic systems, illicit discharges, road sanding, livestock, and channel erosion. So we kind of put that all into the model, and it gives us, in a relative sense, a breakdown of what are the land uses and activities that are contributing to the annual loadings of the various pollutants in the watershed. And these are two pie charts that show the results of the pollutant load modeling for the entire Farm River watershed. So if we kind of aggregate all the pollutant loads that are coming off the landscape to the farm river at the downstream point in the watershed. These are the contributions in a percentage, relative percentage basis. And you can see that, they differ by pollutant. For on the left-hand side, we have fecal coliform. And again, which is that bacteria that we're trying to address. And you can see that the light blue, 26% is urban land, things like commercial properties, residential land uses, roads, what's coming from those developed areas. In the dark green, for example, we have agriculture at 5%, but also the orange wedge, another 5% coming from livestock in the watershed. So about 10% from those agricultural uses. Point out septic systems in the light green, contributing about 13%. And then interestingly, if you look at the dark blue wedge, which is about 34%, these are referred to as illicit connections. And these are essentially connections between things like sanitary sewers and stormwater systems. So these could be illegal connections from bathrooms in commercial areas or places where residential, the system is tied into storm system. They tend to be very variable in a watershed, but when they do exist, and we used, sort of common assumptions that we typically see in urbanized or suburban areas in terms of the number of illicits, they can have a big impact. And so there's a reason that we tend to focus on illicit discharges under the MS4 permit and also in some of these watershed plans. It's really, again, another contribution from those developed land uses in the watershed on top of the land use itself. So let's continue on.
I'll spend some time talking about our visual field assessments. So we spend a fair bit of time reviewing the watershed in a pre-screening effort through GIS and aerial imagery to identify locations throughout the watershed that could be areas that we can find a structural practice, green infrastructure, or maybe a restoration concept that we'll discuss later to basically improve water quality at that location. So we went through the watershed and identified a number of locations, as it says here, identify restoration or pollution prevention or retrofit, green infrastructure, retrofit opportunities. Tend to focus on urbanized areas, but there is also a rural component as well. We also looked at a number of municipal properties throughout the watershed in order to come up with our recommendations that we'll discuss a little bit later in the presentation. And so I worked on this with Southwest Conservation District and also Save the Sound. They were in the field with me. I see Nicole's here and obviously Chris is here. And so we spent 2 pretty long days in the fall, and then there were another couple of days spent in the winter. We had a number of sites, well over 100 that we found as possibilities. There were about 80 that were prioritized, and it really came down to about 50 or 60 that we were able to visit in order to assess in the field. As I said, these were a lot of municipal properties, places where we saw stormwater runoff or, kind of leak-offs getting directly into tributaries or the farm river itself. Some agricultural lands that are adjacent to streams and maybe lacking buffers or other conservation practices. And also through the stream walks that have been conducted in the watershed by a number of different volunteers and organizations, we got additional information about places to either include in a larger assessment of an area. Those basically supplemented our assessment efforts and added to our concepts that we'll discuss later. And so we took those several days of field visits and our assessments and turned it into a matrix that includes 44 sites of potential recommendations. It includes a brief site description, whether or not it's in the flood zone, the types of soils. A and B soils can be very easy to work with in terms of developing infiltrating practices. If we have C's or D soils, as described by NRCS, just needs a little more planning and design effort to make sure that they're going to function as they're intended. And this full list was then used by stakeholders to select the 10 that will be discussed a little bit later in the presentation. But here we are again, another break. If anybody has questions about what Eric reviewed on water quality, or the load modeling, or our visual field assessments, so I'll say we'll dive quite a bit deeper into the field assessments in the next piece.
Okay, there is a question in the chat from Gene. Did you consider remnant tile drains from former ag fields converted to residential property with septic systems as a potential illicit discharge source for fecal bacteria? And maybe you're getting to that detail later, but I figured I'd get the question out there as it came in.
Sure. Yeah. No. The quick answer is, or short answer is no. That level of detail isn't really available or built into the screening level model. It's something that, and I'm not sure, of an easy way to quantify that, in terms of load without having, a really good inventory of where those might be, and the, kind of the level of flows that might be associated with those. But it's certainly something that is worth maybe mentioning in the watershed plan, and possibly there's some recommendations that could go with those, just to make sure that it's not something that's missed as a possible source. And if there's a recommendation that we could make to address some of those, I think that would be a good addition to the plan.
All right, it looks like Jamie, you have your hand up. I'm assuming you want to ask a question.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, and thanks, Eric and Michael. This has been great so far. Just a quick question, just to improve my understanding of illicit connections and the assumption, because it is sort of it's a model input, right, to a degree. Right. So, typically, are we talking about sort of a few number of large sort of discharges, or is this more like many kind of small discharges? And given the size of the wedge, I understand we'll get to the recommendations later, but
right.
Just highlighting sort of the specific recommendations that address that wedge.
Sure. Yeah. So the assumptions that go into the model are that there is essentially 1 in every 1,000 residential connections is an illicit connection, so coming from someone's house, and then 5% of businesses have some form of illicit connection, and those are assumed to have some form of sanitary component, sanitary sewage component. So the concentration of those tend to be high. They tend to be on the order of 1 million colonies per 100 milliliter, as opposed to what you might see in runoff, which might be a few hundred or 1,000. So because even though they're very small numbers we're talking about, even a few of those can have a pretty big impact on the overall loading in the watershed. And if you look at so I think what a good point is that the illicit connections tend to be much higher in the more developed areas of the watershed, where you have larger population or greater commercial land use. And if you look at the numbers, the percentages, contribution from illicits in those local basins, those 14 or so local basins in the watershed, they range from less, somewhere 0 and up to, I think, about 65%. So the average for the watershed is kind of in the low 30s, but there are definitely many local basins that have very low bacteria or no bacteria contributions from illicit. So yeah, it's one of those things that's highly variable, but when you have one, it tends to dominate, and it tends to be, there's a reason that the illicit discharge program is really considered the low-hanging fruit in the MS4 permit, because that's something that you can easily, well, not easily, but eliminate, and if there are ever there, it has a big impact on the bacteria loadings, especially in urban, suburban areas. So hopefully that helps answer that question.
Thanks a lot, Eric. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't see anything else in the chat. Nobody else has their hands up. Does anybody else have any other questions to this point? All right, I think it's good for you guys to keep moving forward.
Okay. All right, so we're going to shift into the draft recommendations in the watershed management plan itself. And again, the whole point of the watershed plan is to identify measures, that are going to either reduce those pollutant loads that we talked about, of bacteria, of nutrients, of sediment, or protect higher quality surface water, groundwater, drinking water sources. So we have sort of a dual focus. And the watershed plan itself, obviously it includes a characterization of the current watershed conditions and pollutant sources, like we've already discussed, identifies prioritized actions, and it also identifies a water quality monitoring needs. How can we continue to monitor the quality of water in the watershed to see how we're doing in terms of implementing, watershed management practices, recommendations from the plan, efforts by NRCS and producers to address some of the non-point source runoff issues. Another key objective is to just increase public awareness. Part of this watershed planning effort, and the reason we have a plan, is to raise awareness from the general public and from municipal officials and municipal staff about the importance of watershed management and protecting the Farm River. We're also trying to increase involvement by the communities and strengthen the partnerships of all the stakeholders, and we have an excellent base to start with, given all the work that's been done by the partners to date. And then, as I mentioned before, we're trying to satisfy the NRCS and the DEEP and EPA requirements for watershed plans so that the Farm River is well positioned for future funding and technical assistance from NRCS. So in terms of the framework of the plan itself, we're going to be talking about both watershed-wide or kind of town-wide strategies that can be applied pretty much anywhere in the watershed. And then we're going to be talking about a host of site-specific or more targeted concepts and projects that can either improve water quality or preserve and protect high water quality. And the plan itself presents recommendations on basically a 10-year planning horizon. So these kinds of plans are typically updated once every 10 years. And we're going to break our recommendations into things that are short-term. So what should be addressed in the next few years. Midterm are those kind of 2 to 5 year recommendations that might take a little bit more either funding, planning, or just coordination to tackle. And then those longer term projects, those are the the bigger restoration projects, maybe some of those green infrastructure retrofits or some of the nature-based solution restoration items that really take more planning. And those are kind of the 5 to 10 year type recommendations. And one thing I'll note is that there are many recommendations in this plan. There's a lot in here, a lot of information. There are things to be tackled by different groups, different stakeholders and partners. But overall, the success of this plan is really long-term, requires coordination of many partners and sort of a long-term commitment. There's no silver bullet that's going to address the problems in the Farm River. And so it's a very holistic approach. And it does require cooperation by many, many partners. This is not a permit requirement. This is a voluntary collaboration of folks working to restore and protect the river itself. So next slide, Michael. So we start out really with recommendations to build capacity, really to kind of build on the stakeholder group, the project steering committee, and really bring folks together so that you can get the plan off the ground. And we recommend that the best way to start off is really to establish a formal watershed coalition for the Farm River. And preferably, you can get a paid coordinator position that really could take the lead and actually devote some time and effort and energy to implementing and coordinating all this, the partners and stakeholders in this watershed. So that's really a first step. And I think you have an excellent framework with the steering committee and the various partners that have already been working on watershed issues for years now, really. So that's a good foundation. The municipalities in the watershed should really endorse the plan, and this is something that is both symbolic but also potentially a commitment to funding some of the work that's got to be done on municipal properties or through implementation of MS4 permits requirements and other voluntary efforts. So looking to get the endorsement, from each of the watershed municipalities to really kick off the watershed, plan implementation phase. And then obviously this third item here, identify and pursue additional funding sources. Without funding, a lot of this just is not possible. So, there needs to be, some folks that are looking out and seeking grant funding for projects in the watershed, whether it's the municipalities, the conservation district, regional water authority, other partners like Save the Sound, folks that are good at going out and getting grant funding, can help, leverage those funding programs that are out there to really, to implement the measures in the plan. And in section 6 of the document, we'll share a comprehensive list of funding sources. These are, primarily grant funding sources, but also, a lot of the NRCS technical assistance and funding programs are in there. Some newer funding sources that are coming out related to infrastructure that we're seeing through FEMA, and the federal legislation that hopefully will be passed soon will augment, some of the money that's been there traditionally for water quality and for climate resilience type of work. So I think we're at an exciting point because there is, clearly a focus on not only water quality, but also on climate and resilience type projects. We also recommend a continuation of a number of existing water quality monitoring programs in the watershed. The USGS monitoring that's been ongoing now for, I don't know, about a year now, Chris, in sort of this along the Farm River in the center of the watershed. That's been a great, start to develop a baseline of water quality in the Farm River, and it really, augments the kind of the every, 5 years or so deep ambient water quality monitoring that is good, but it's just not as frequent. So continuing that in terms of nutrients and especially bacteria would be very helpful moving forward to get a better baseline, also to develop better, more accurate bacterial load reduction targets, from the TMDL that was established based on limited data. So we're also looking to recommend at least expanding this bacteria monitoring program to other parts of the watershed. So along the main stem of the Farm River, tributaries, coordinate with the regional water authority that at one time was also conducting routine bacteria monitoring, both in wet and dry weather conditions. So that again, that would really, I think, strengthen the understanding of the bacteria impairments in the watershed and those load reductions that are required to make it fishable and swimmable. We also think that continuation of the great work that's being done by Friends of the Farm River Estuary in the estuary portion of the river makes all the sense in the world. And then we also added a few things like reviewing the MS4 permit outfall monitoring data that the municipalities are collecting, for their own stormwater systems, and really, reviewing that, particularly with regards to bacteria and nutrient contributions from some of the major outfalls that discharge into the river. And then the last thing we recommend is, what do you do with this data? You really should be looking at it on an annual basis. What does it all mean? What are the trends? A basic annual water quality monitoring summary would be a good way to get a handle on that, provide some outreach to the community on the conditions in the river. And then the next step may be every 5 years, develop something like the water quality report card that's been done for the Long Island Sound and for a number of the embayments around the Sound. This requires a little more effort and analysis, but it's something that can be very useful in terms of an outreach piece and understanding of what's going on in the Farm River. And then lastly, Michael mentioned that Save the Sound and the Conservation District completed some stream walks in the watershed. These are great ways to get a bird's eye view of the rivers and streams themselves, the conditions of the river corridor, and those pollutant sources that are impacting the river itself. So we suggest that those continue and be done at least once every 5 years or so to update conditions, and more importantly, based on what's found in terms of issues, to track down the sources of pollutants. And I think that's kind of the next step, using the work that was done last year, is to start doing some of these track down surveys to really pinpoint where some of the pollutants are coming from, and identify in addition to the projects that we found, other types of projects that might be implemented in the watershed. And I think that it would make sense to to also, again, develop more detailed sub-watershed action plans for some of these priority sub-watersheds. You know, our scope only allowed us to cover so much ground in the watershed. And so there's a lot of, territory that we didn't get to. And so, down the road, it would make sense to develop some more detailed planning efforts focused on the Burrs Brook, Loney Brook, maybe the estuary portion of the watershed to get a better handle on issues and potential projects.
And we discussed the green infrastructure a little bit earlier. We're recommending watershed-wide green infrastructure assessments. It's hard. I don't think we've saturated what kind of opportunities we can do in any watershed. And so throughout the watershed, there are opportunities to implement site-specific stormwater retrofits. These are not in line with the existing stormwater system, but bioretention systems or surface infiltration systems that are off the line of the main stormwater system, or in a place where there isn't a stormwater system conveying water directly into the surface water. And so we want to try to capture and infiltrate things as much as possible. And so we're recommending that watershed wide, but there are ways to be more selective about how to prioritize those sites. Most municipal sites, properties have green infrastructure retrofit opportunities. Most state and local roads in the watershed roadside area provides green infrastructure opportunities. We recommend that the use of green infrastructure and low impact development should be required in new development and redevelopment. It's a MS4 requirement, I believe, for subdivision regulations. That LID is a component of those regulations, and for all MS4 towns, which is everybody in this watershed. And then, as it always comes back to, as Eric mentioned before, it's really can be hinged on funding. And so there's also ways to create funding. Recently, the state created enabling legislation for towns to create a stormwater utility. This is something that's been piloted by New Haven and other larger communities, and they've had some success. And so this is something to consider as a community as a way to develop dedicated financing that would then be reinvested right back into managing stormwater, but in the most green and sort of sustainable way possible. So some of the examples of surface green infrastructure are, bioretention basins. You can see the same basin in this picture here as in the fully flowered out picture here. And you can see they carefully selected it next to this catch basin. So when the bioretention system is getting more than it can handle, it has an overflow there. It's not going to impact greater than its footprint. It's going to always be positioned in a way that it can successfully overflow into the existing system without kind of overwhelming the area around it. You could also retrofit bioretention systems, surface bioretention systems in the islands or medians in a parking lot, where we find that we can do that a lot, either as in the design process, incorporating into design, or as a retrofit. And tree box filters, as you see on the lower right there, also very popular as a retrofit and can be done at a low cost. The town of East Lyme has been very creative in coming up with an even lower cost version that they've been very successful in implementing throughout their town. There are also subsurface infiltration systems when you don't have the land area available to put in a rain garden or a larger bioretention system. It can be these the large orange subsurface chamber system. Water is conveyed into that through a stormwater system, and then just there is infiltrating media under that, and it can slowly work its way into the native soil below. Again, East Lyme, you have infiltrating catch basin. So this is the installation of an infiltrating catch basin at East Lyme High School. And this is what it ends up with. So you don't see anything on the surface. This catch basin in the center of the new pavement goes directly to those infiltrating catch basins where they percolate through that concrete structure into the native soil. in tighter places where you have roads and sidewalks, you can utilize subsurface systems under the sidewalk or create a wider sidewalk with a greenway or a parkway next to it, a pocket park, and have those subsurface systems taking the stormwater off the streets or off the sidewalks and putting it directly into the soil rather than conveying it out of the area. And so that is it conceptually, but we do have a number of sites. I would say out of our 10 sites, maybe 5 have green infrastructure as the focus or as an element within the proposal. So for residential areas, we have 3 concept areas that have green infrastructure proposed in on the residential streets. There's not really enough time to go through all 10 of our concepts in this presentation. I would really love to do that because I think it's just an exciting process to find these sites and then work through these concepts. I would suggest going to section 4 that Southwest Conservation District has put online. You can see better descriptions of the sites, what we're proposing, and sort of how we envision the restoration concepts or the green infrastructure that we're proposing. But just very quickly, this is a set of small residential streets in North Brantford, just off of Forest Road. And you can see we're able to fit in the green circles are tree filters, the green shaded areas are bioretention basins. And so we can mix these into the existing stormwater system, always putting them upstream, up gradient of the existing catch basins on the streets, and catch that stormwater, intercept it as much as we can before it goes into the stormwater system and then is going out to the river. So this also has an interesting piece, which I think should really be noted, is that Chris was able to get NatureWorks Garden Center on board to have some roadside fire retention on their property and in their property as to disconnect some of their impervious area on the site. So finding property owners, either businesses or private homeowners or private that are also interested in these same outcomes. And I think there probably are a lot. So that sort of engagement will only increase the effectiveness of these kinds of practices. We also visited a number of municipal facilities throughout the watershed. Here's just a couple of examples. The image here is the Veterans Memorial Ice Rink in East Haven. This has a lot of impervious area right next to the Farm River, and everything is pretty much conveyed from Hudson Street. And the middle school just to the west, and the ice rink directly into the Farm River. And so we can use pretty much all the GI systems that we've talked about, the infiltrating catch basins or the orange circles, tree box filters in certain locations, and then where we can fit the bioretention basins, we can have those really configured to the site that to that location. And what that would do was disconnect a significant amount of the impervious surfaces that are really just being conveyed directly into the river right there. This little segment of the Farm River has about almost a 15% impervious cover. So if we can disconnect a couple of acres, we can make a market improvement. Another green infrastructure concept that's a little newer and more complicated and also can be almost seen as a restoration practice is called a regenerative stormwater conveyance. And these are practices designed where it's hard to implement other stormwater GI or retrofit other sort of green infrastructure. And it's essentially creating a system of shallow pools, riffles, and using vegetation and infiltrating media to create turning a drainage channel into what you see in the lower left, which is one being constructed, I believe in Colorado. But there's a number of things it does. It slows down stormwater. So peak flow can be a concern where it's really just sending water directly into our main water bodies and streams and rivers. And it's also picking up sediment as it goes, and sediments can carry other pollutants with it. So if we can slow down the water, the infiltrating media under that stone and those large boulders that act as sort of weir structures, we can do some retention and some infiltration in the regenerative stormwater conveyance and slow down the overall peak flow and the overall volume that's being sent quickly to our streams and rivers, so we can slow it down. The goal for these is a 1-inch that they can store up to a 1-inch storm. That's always the design goal. We have several of these in our concepts, and how they get implemented will require some assessments. They tend to be, as you can see from the price estimate here, they tend to be expensive because they're a fairly complicated structure and very site-specific to design and to implement, and then the construction sequence as well. But they are effective after the outfall of improving water quality. So that was some of our sort of on-the-ground work. Again, our watershed-wide recommendations are going back to some of these retrofits, is that homeowners can do this as well. And some people can do it on their own. The goal is to have them disconnect any of their impervious surfaces, which is pretty much driveways and their roof drainage. Roof drainage is also going down into the ground. That's the way my house was built. When we got here, everything was going down and getting conveyed kind of directly into the wetland right behind our house. So we just pull those out and have them go out onto the lawn, or send them into a rain garden or a rain barrel. There are lots of incentive programs that can help homeowners learn about how to do this or how to actually do it. Eastern Connecticut Conservation District has done a number of programs over the years where they've done how-to workshops and actually helped subsidize the cost of rain barrels, how-to workshops on building, how to build a rain garden, but actually building a rain garden at the same time. And then we also could have rebate systems, giveaway programs on materials, certification programs to sort of celebrate the businesses or the homeowners that utilize these programs, to kind of celebrate that people are working hard on this problem and all thinking about it as stewarding the watershed together as a community. Another place that homeowners can be more involved in municipalities in terms of their regulations is addressing subsurface disposal systems. By that we mean septic systems. It's really hard to evaluate the number of septic systems that may be contributing bacteria and nutrients to our impairments in the watershed. And the best way to do that is to be proactive with these systems and to be, first of all, encouraging homeowners to maintain them and to follow the maintenance schedule that Department of Public Health or the local health districts recommend. There could be more effort on inventorying and mapping and prioritizing areas for that kind of either maintenance or just sort of assessing systems. And then from the state or the municipal side, we've been encouraging in all plans, really all of our watershed plans, to update regulations and requirements about inspecting systems and upgrades when homes are sold. There's a failing system and it's sold to the next owner. There could be a way to incentivize either the owner or the purchaser in upgrading that system. And overall, we're just talking about more stringent standards in order to protect the inland freshwater and the coast water systems. Eric, do you want to take this over? I think you're muted.
Thanks. So another topic that is a major one that communities are already dealing with is the MS4 permit. So MS4 is really the federal and state permit program for municipal storm discharges to water bodies, and it regulates the quality of those discharges. All of the watershed towns and the Connecticut DOT are subject to the permit requirements. And I won't go into detail about the MS4 permit, but we'll say that there are a number of overlapping areas between the watershed recommendations and what's required by the permit itself. I mentioned already the illicit discharge detection and elimination programs that are required for towns to implement, to go out and inspect and monitor outfalls during dry weather for finding these discharges in their systems, and then eliminating the ones that they do find to really knock down that 33%, 35% that could be contributing to the bacteria levels in the more urban areas of the watershed. And there's a number of other recommendations or requirements in the permit related to education and outreach and public involvement, and also requirements for land use regulations to require the use of things like low impact development and those green infrastructure practices that Michael talked about already. Next slide, Michael. And again, one of the recommendations, in addition to the communities fully implementing their MS4 programs, which is a requirement of the permit, we also recognize that communities are often strapped both financially and in terms of staff resources, and so often it's easier to comply with the permit requirements by sharing resources and being part of some of these regional stormwater collaboratives that have formed in New England and also a few in Connecticut. And one example is the Eastern Connecticut Stormwater Collaborative through the Eastern Connecticut Conservation District. And they have a pretty good, robust program for many of the towns in the eastern part of the state. One possibility is to either develop a similar collaborative for the New Haven area communities or South Central Connecticut, or for the watershed communities to maybe take advantage of what Eastern Connecticut's already doing and join their group. So, at a minimum, there's a possibility of sharing resources, and I think, improving the effectiveness of the MS4 compliance throughout the watershed. The next topic is really kind of shifting from developed area stormwater runoff to agricultural non-point source runoff. And as this graphic shows, much of the farmland in the watershed is really focused on the middle and northern parts of the watershed, a major portion of which is in town of North Branford. And the town of North Branford really, has a long history of agriculture. And there's been a lot of farming and agricultural activities in the watershed. I think we're seeing, we've been seeing, like many places in Connecticut, some of those ag activities shifting to more tourist-based agriculture. Pick your own, farm stands. A lot of the kind of more popular activities that we're seeing statewide. But there still remains a fair number of farms and agricultural activities that are really clustered along the Farm River corridor in the central and northern parts of the watershed, as well as into Wallingford and the far northern part of East Haven. So again, there's these activities are potential sources of pollutants, both sediment and nutrients and bacteria, both for surface waters and to groundwater, especially in this blue shaded area, all of which contributes to our drinking water in the watershed. This photo here shows an example of one of the agricultural fields in the watershed. You can see that there's been some erosion from the drainage channels that run through these properties. So in a heavy rain event, there's some sediment that likely leaves the property. There is some cover crop here, even during the fall and the winter, but the drainage issues on some of these sites can be an issue in terms of sediment and the pollutants that are being discharged to the streams from erosion on the sites. Next photo shows examples of farms that are either adjacent to the Farm River. In the top photo, we have the Farm River corridor just off to the right of the photo. And then this lower right-hand corner photo, this is a ford crossing, crossing where either tractors or vehicles cross the river itself. And so you can see that in many places there are streams flowing through some of the ag properties in the watershed. And then this last photo here, this is an example of where we have, this is on, I think, Forest Road in North Branford. This is ag land owned by the town, and where the yellow arrow is pointing to, there's an inlet pipe, or an inlet to an underground pipe that then crosses under the road and discharges to a wetland on the other side of the street. So, this is an example of where agricultural runoff can actually be hard piped, right into either wetlands or to the river itself. So, the emphasis in the watershed plan really is twofold. One is to focus on, continuing to work with producers and the farm owners on implementing agricultural conservation practices. And this practice here is probably one of the more, most effective, and one of the biggest recommendations in the plan is to implement improvements to those vegetated buffer areas along the streams and river corridors that are, again, adjacent to or running through many of these properties. Use of vegetated filter strips and exclusion fencing in areas where there may be livestock accessing and walking through the stream or right up to the stream's edge, again, are common conservation practices that NRCS can work with property owners to implement on their properties. And even the benefits of even a narrow buffer, a 10 to 30 foot buffer can have significant benefits. It doesn't have to be, the 100 or 200 foot, ideal buffer that you see in textbooks. So, there are ways to, improve water quality just through implementing some of these practices. And this is not the only practice. The next slide shows a list of other practices that, could be implemented, and I'm sure, have been to some degree in the watershed already, in terms of focusing on some of those livestock areas where there's manure collection and storage, managing nutrients through manure management, and use of cover crops, really focusing on minimizing the time that the soil is exposed, the bare earth is exposed, and also focusing on soil health. Soil health is a big kind of more common recommended best practice for agricultural areas and farmland. There's a lot of cropland in the watershed. So minimizing, again, the exposure of bare earth, minimizing the amount of tillage that happens, rotating crops, and really maintaining that health of the soil, not compacting it, and working it so much that, it becomes, sort of a more efficient source of both nutrients, sediment, and water to, to the river. Another area of focus in the plan is on farmland preservation. And we know that North Brantford in particular has a big emphasis on conserving the rural character of the Farm River Corridor in their plan of conservation and development. So it's kind of part of the fabric of the community. And so not only, conserving the land for those purposes, but also, conserving the land and protecting it against future development. I think, some of the farmland is already conserved in preservation practices, either through easements or purchase of development rights, but there's still a fair amount that is unprotected and may only be in a Public Act 490 program, which is a temporary, protection that provides, essentially tax incentives or tax breaks, for agricultural producers. So I think, a big focus here is on maintaining the undeveloped character of the corridor through farmland preservation and also through preservation of forest land in the watershed, obviously, that's not currently already protected. And so that's part of the open space recommendations, in the watershed plan itself. We also address climate resilience. So the issues of climate change. I think we're all, seeing, firsthand many of the impacts of some of these severe storms we've had, over the past few weeks alone, with increased, extreme downpours we've been getting in terms of the flooding, the pollution that those events mobilize, but also, things like drought, and climate change is predicted to increase, periods of drought, and low flows in some of these rivers can, exacerbate some of the, the aquatic life impairments. So many of the communities, or several of the communities, and typically more of the coastal communities, have already focused on developing, coastal climate resilience plans. The inland communities, North Brantford and Wallingford, should also be looking at some of these climate issues and developing, coordinated plans to address both, too much rainfall and not enough rainfall, and how that's going to be impacted in the future, and how that translates to water quality impacts in terms of, a warmer, wetter climate means, greater pollutant loads delivered to, many of our water bodies. So there are a host of recommendations in the plan itself regarding climate resilience, design storm precipitation, looking at really these nature-based solutions, kind of using nature to not only improve water quality, but also make the watershed more resilient to some of these extreme events. And then lastly, there is also a category of recommendations that kind of fall under the land use policy and planning. So how can the communities look at and update their land use policies and regulations to really improve water quality, to strengthen their stormwater regulations in line with the MS4 permit, to, I think, strengthen and improve the uniformity of the wetland regulations of the communities in the watershed. But also look at things like climate and climate resilience opportunities to, again, as part of new development, redevelopment, and protection strategies focused on enhancing climate resilience in the watershed. We have some strategies in there in terms of overlay zones, and one in particular is referred to as a stream belt protection overlay zone that actually the town of North Branford has already implemented. So it's a good example for other towns in the watershed to look at, but it essentially provides an additional layer of protection, review, and oversight of certain development projects and land use activities that'll protect both in terms of water quality and flooding along the river corridor. So I think North Branford is an excellent example of what could be done. There are other, I think, more aggressive stream belt protection regulations in other parts of Connecticut. So there are other examples as well. And then lastly, one of the recommendations from the Governor's Council on Climate Change, the GC3 group that was recently came out as part of their report, suggested implementation at a statewide level, at least, of a no net loss of forest policy. And this basically is designed to protect, again, those privately owned forested properties from further development. So it's not the land that's already protected by a regional water authority, but some of the private landowners that have forest stands either in production or just privately owned forests that are susceptible to future development, to develop land uses. And so this no net loss of forest policy would essentially provide measures to offset or mitigate any planned or permitted forest loss, and provide incentives for kind of stewardship and long-term retention of privately owned forests. So the Farm River watershed could be a good pilot for this recommendation that's made at the state level as part of a climate adaptation, climate resilience strategy, but also a water quality strategy.
I think that's a nice segue to our next section, which is about some of the recommendations we've included on nature-based solutions. Forest and other wetlands and other systems, either riparian or farther away from our streams and water bodies. They are the ones that essentially have been doing the work since the beginning of time on keeping water quality as it has been. Vegetation on an open piece of land will improve infiltration. Improved infiltration, you can catch, not only retain and slow the release of that, so you can slow the peak flows in streams. You can also infiltrate nutrients and bacteria, which can be basically captured there either by plants or you catch the bacteria in those locations. You also get other added benefits of natural systems, of improved climate resilience, more shaded streams, like I said, moderating peak flows. You also get carbon storage and improved habitat and potentially increased biodiversity. And then there's this other added, in populated places such as this and a lot of Connecticut, you get this potential where a nature-based solution can not just look at what sort of improvements can be done with respect to water quality or other further concerns about our natural environment, but it can be, you can have a second priority of, well, can the space also be used by the public? I know Meriden has done that with some of their flood control projects where they have created parks that also can be public access, and at the times when there are floods, the park is closed. So you have multiple opportunities that can serve multiple priorities for the community. We're going to talk through a few of these that have been applied to our concepts. The expansion of vegetation buffers, not only with respect to agriculture, but really across the watershed should be encouraged. Enhancing wetlands or floodplains. Restoring uplands and in some locations, but that gets to kind of keeping our forests as healthy as we can and sort of creating forests when possible. Another restorative action is addressing where it seems like crossings pinch the Farm River or other tributaries and create a constriction that causes erosion downstream and faster flows. And so we'll walk through some of those. Our first one is buffer enhancement. So this is back to our 10 concepts. The pink here is the areas that we are proposing for a buffer to be enhanced or expanded. There are several sites, several of the concepts have different areas of buffer enhancement. They really range from like up to 6 or 7 acres at some of the sites to really just a sort of a ribbon of an area in other properties or other sites rather. The idea really is just to create that buffer capacity that can provide a filtration area against the water body. The prices are really done per acre, or the costs rather have been estimated per acre. So it's hard for us to estimate one cost, but you can see here based on the scale of the enhancement and expansion is what we can kind of estimate it at. And we basically are estimating or recommending a minimum width of 25 feet on those improved buffer areas. And the idea is to get back to a native vegetation that's not maintained, not landscaped, stabilize eroding banks and eroding slopes if they're there, and ideally removing invasive species, and so that the native species can have optimal coverage. Another restorative action we're recommending at a number of sites is the blue hatched areas within these drainage channels or along the Farm River in the lower left. Degrading streams can be a number of situations. You can have banks that are eroding and bare, or banks that are being undercut by high flows, and then you're losing that sediment, and then it's dropping more of the bank into the river. You can also have channels themselves that are degraded or have been modified, or that are head cutting, which is that the channel bed is being lost over time with each large storm event. And so the idea is to assess these for restoration practices, either the banks themselves or the channel or both. In the top right, which is near Bourbon Drive in Branford, we have a long channel that is contributing stormwater to a tidal marsh, which is just east of the Farm River estuary. And so if we can decentralize our approach to managing stormwater a little more effectively by using green infrastructure, you can see some there as a regenerative stormwater conveyance as well. Maybe some of those practices would have enough benefit, or maybe not, and the bank and channel restoration is a further step that would help keep sediment and pollutants out of the estuary. We're also proposing restoring wetlands and floodplains in selected areas in the concepts. So floodplain restoration would be, identifying where the floodplain is located. We can use the National Flood Insurance Program's mapping, but it really takes a little more ground truthing of those areas as well. But again, getting in there and looking at drainage, looking at species coverage or bare ground possibly, and restoring that so that when there is a flood event, that there is a place to collect, retain, store, infiltrate that water, as opposed to it just heading down a channelized section and getting right into the Farm River. For this site, which you see at the bottom at Burrs Brook, this one really was highlighted because even though Burrs Brook has a fair amount of forest, probably close to 40%, much of that is on the outer edges of the subwatershed, and there's a lot of development within the riparian corridor of Burrs Brook. This was one of the few properties that we found along the brook itself where there was room to create some restorative practices. And so there are a number of elements going on here, and with buffer restoration in pink, floodplain creation potentially just north of the existing floodplain. This darker blue area would be to expand the floodplain. You can't see it here, but a lot of Burrs Brook is quite channelized, and it looks like it's eroding that channel deeper as it goes. So if there's an area where we can retain and slow flow into the wetlands and floodplains that are already there, but just create optimal function, that would be ideal. Just as a discussion about wetland restoration and creation, we have both at what we've proposed at North Branford's high school and intermediate school. It's one large campus. The larger wetland here is up north near the high school. And we talked about regenerative stormwater conveyances earlier. So we have a lot of stormwater come into this wetland. The wetland is there and is doing somewhat of a job, but we could kind of get rid of this concentrated flow and really disperse flow into the entire wetland. Because just south of that, it comes into an area where there's really just a stream at this location in this other image. And we could add a stormwater wetland here. Stormwater wetlands are created wetlands with a specific function of addressing issues created by stormwater. And so we're talking about attenuating peak flow and reducing the pollutant loads in there. Just south of Forest Road is where all of this water then enters Burrs Brook. So we would like to address that as soon as possible before it gets down into Burrs Brook itself. You can see the picture just above that. So we have 3 outfalls coming into this area at this proposed stormwater wetland. And so there's a lot of water coming in and not a lot of area to really do anything about it. So a stormwater wetland could create some measurable improvement to that existing system. I mentioned this briefly, that stream crossings, this is what we have here in the bottom right at Burrs Brook is actually the site that we were just looking at with floodplain restoration and creation. And when you have a river of a certain size or a stream of a certain size that is then forced to pass through a smaller structure, you get sort of a fire hose effect on the downstream side. And the area highlighted in yellow is the erosion that's taking place when you have high flows blasting through and hitting that left bank and sort of chewing it away and further sending sediment and possibly pollutants downstream as well. There's another, there's our estimates on replacement versus, here we go. Sorry about that. That should have gone. So removal of a structure like this is far less expensive than a replacement of a much larger structure. There are 2 crossings in the top right here, which is the Farm River corridor in North Branford, south of Auger Road and north of Pages Mill Pond. We have a large collection of municipal properties, much of which is leased out for agriculture. And if we are able to remove some of these crossings, we're just keeping, we're opening the stream back up to its original span. There's a ford crossing here. If we can avoid a ford crossing, we're able to keep that potential for creating loose sediment when a tractor or a vehicle passes through. But these are larger, concrete open bottom box structures that would be more expensive to install, but end up creating a better. They would be cheaper just to remove, but the crossings are still seem to be required in those locations. And our last one on removing structures that cause constrictions is a little bit different. This is down right on the town line of Branford and East Haven at the end of the estuary. You can see the yellow box noting the project area. This constriction is downstream of about 200 acres or so of the estuary. And so the idea is just to look at how this constriction might be affecting tidal exchange and the flushing rates that, excuse me, that should naturally take place in the estuary. This is, it might address, and the assessment would be to understand what the structures are, and would there be any water quality benefits to removing these structures that pinch the farm river and the estuary itself. It's important to note this wouldn't be addressing the pollutant loads that affect the estuary, but it may address what the water quality issues are in the estuary if the tidal exchange is improved and the flushing rate is improved in the estuary. So that is our final review on our concept. Again, I would say review all 10 in more detail in section 4, which the Conservation District has put up on their website, in addition to the other sections 3 and 5. Anybody have any questions about the recommendations that we've been discussing?
Yeah, Michael, this is Chris. There is a question in the chat that I'll just read. Are there articles available that are clear and directed to the general public that can be published locally to encourage buy-in for town residents to be willing to support these policies despite the additional burden to development?
That's a tough one. I'm not quite sure, specifically, what is being asked for, but I mean, I'm sure we could, cite or reference, some additional materials that that may be helpful, to kind of make the case, that this, that the benefit, the long-term benefit, that the bigger picture benefits, in terms of both water quality and the associated, quality of life and economic benefits, are offset, some of the, the costs associated with some of these practices. In terms of the stormwater, practices, for example, the green stormwater that we talked about, there's actually literally a real monetary benefit to using, in many cases, the low impact development approach, because it actually can reduce costs in terms of fewer underground pipes and structures, and putting more things on the surface. So, it depends on which recommendations that we're talking about. Some are easier to justify and to provide, lots of clear documentation in terms of benefits versus cost. But I know in terms of the nature-based solutions, there's also quite a bit of work that's been done on trying to quantify those benefits associated with the climate resilience piece of it. It costs a lot less in the long run not to have to keep replacing culverts that blow out because they're undersized, or the benefits provided by a floodplain restoration project that might save damages to structures and infrastructure in the area. So I mean, it really depends on which practices we're talking about, but we could certainly provide some links to those kinds of documents, whether it's in the plan or if you're interested for another purpose.
I would add that Yukon, through the Sea Grant and also through Yukon Clear and NEMO, there's a number of resources that they have developed that are specific to Connecticut and also specific to coastal impairments or coastal watersheds in Connecticut, whether it's businesses or a homeowner or municipal, encouraging municipalities or providing enough background for municipalities to make the leap to improve regulations for some of these practices.
Thank you both. Jamie, I see your hand. There's one more question in the chat box that I'll read first. Question from Ron. Well done. Have you looked at the large lot commercial parking lots for any site recommendations? And then also, North Branford High School is undergoing a major renovation, and he suggests the conceptual plan be submitted to the town. And I'll let Eric and Michael dig into that, but I know that there has been some communication between the town and Michael through this process, but you can certainly dig into that answer more.
Sure. I didn't mention that, and I'm glad they brought it up. The concept does have an area highlighted, and we're recommending that we came up with green infrastructure for the existing parking lots, and then heard that there was a plan to redevelop. And so we sort of found what that approximate footprint is and added it to the concept, and highlighted that those parking lots that are going to be redeveloped should incorporate some green water and some green infrastructure into those parking lots. And I think those lots of opportunities, but it would kind of need an additional review. And in terms of commercial parking lots, I think our concepts are developed somewhat as those site-specific recommendations on what can be done and how, for the most part. They also are intended to serve as a model for other areas where we can see, well, this is how we can fit in tree filters, or this is how we can locate a bioretention basin. We did do just some roadside assessments, and we did a lot of municipal property. We did fewer private properties only because of the permission it requires to create those projects. But it doesn't mean that there's not a lot of parking lots. I would say primarily in that sort of downtown East Haven area, right close to the Farm River. Actually, that could be great opportunities.
Yeah, I think there's a whole host of commercial opportunities for implementing these practices on commercial properties. What we normally see is, as these properties are redeveloped, a developer comes in, upgrades a commercial property, or builds out pad lots that they typically are going to do what's required per the local land use regulations. So the important part is that the regs be in place to require the use of the green infrastructure practices and the low impact development. And right now, communities are in the process of updating their land use regulations for the MS4 permit, so that they're consistent with the requirements in the permit for retention and treatment of stormwater. So that's a really important step that communities really need to implement, and to make sure that they have the controls are in place, so that when that redevelopment happens, it's done in a way that looks like a lot of the concepts that we've shown.
I think it's a lost opportunity to not have a commercial large lot conceptual plan. I've seen that in the West River Watershed Management Plan, the Mill River, that at least having something on paper, say this is what could be done, I think would go a long way to getting the town to adopt those regulations that would cause those changes on those properties to happen. That's my 2 cents on that.
Yep.
Thanks, Ron. Jamie, I know you had your hand up.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate it. I just I had a few thoughts specifically related to this subject of sort of getting buy-in from the municipalities. I think related to that, first I think the recommendation to hire a coordinator to sort of help manage the or coordinate the hopeful implementation of the plan going forward. It seems like a sort of critical threshold recommendation that's really going to enable a lot of these things to be realized. So I certainly fully endorse that. Relatedly, I have a lot of concern about the resources available at the municipalities, and given their ever-growing lists of priorities, the sort of where this type of thing may fall for them. So the idea that we could put together something sort of short and crisp potentially, or point them in the right direction to materials that would help explain the social and economic benefits of some of these types of things, even if we can't quantify them on a sort of plan project specific basis, but just giving them a better sense of the value of it may go a long way. Relatedly, the idea of creating a sort of regional body, or some sort of convening of the municipalities to sort of share resources and discuss these issues, especially given the fact that the watershed extends throughout all these different jurisdictions. and multiple jurisdictions may have, authority over a particular project or not, getting everybody on the same page that way seems like it would be super valuable. And I think, potentially a lot of the kind of the more rural municipalities or some of the, the areas that might have less resources could benefit a lot from experiences in, New Haven and elsewhere. And I just, since we have the representative on the phone, I'll also mention that our friends at Deep, I'm sure, and especially in the EQ branch, are very much in need of additional resources. The other thing is just, mentioning open space watershed land acquisition or in general. I was glad to see the idea of sort of looking forward and preserving the space that we have, in addition to sort of remedying the problems that exist. I think there's a lot of opportunities in the estuary for climate resilience type products or projects. So, especially given the funding that's coming, so from the federal government and elsewhere. So I think the idea of sub-watershed studies is also a really, really good idea, and can help us start to carve wedges out of the pie wherever we can. So that's it. That was my only feedback. Try to keep it at a high level, and thank you guys so much for this presentation. It was great.
Thanks,
Any
Jamie.
comments?
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in real quick and answer a piece to that, because I agree that having a coordinator position is a great value for a watershed, and having the towns work together on funding or initiatives is something that actually exists in the Norwalk River. In southwestern Connecticut, there's the Norwalk River Watershed Initiative, where all the municipalities in the watershed actually come to meetings, and we actually, as the district, are kind of coordinating that effort right now. We've had a meeting or two with that group recently, and we have another meeting coming up in October where we're going to be discussing a coordinator position and what that sort of job description would look like. So there is some models that exist for exactly the kind of things you were talking about, Jamie, and I'll speak for the district and say that we'd be glad to work with the municipalities in the Farm River to try to get something similar up and running to try to implement the recommendations of this plan. I don't know if Eric or Michael, you're going to say anything in response to that, but Chris Malik, I see your hand next.
I would just say briefly that Jamie's comment about creating something that's distilled down from municipalities to quickly understand what their what the priorities could be for municipality in the plan, I think is a excellent comment.
Yeah, I'll
Chris,
take
you
my
wanna go?
turn. Am I unmuted? Yeah.
No, you're
Jamie,
good, Chris.
Jamie, excellent comments. I really think that we should put a star on everything you said, including more resources for Deep. We were talking today actually in the West River meeting about additional money that's going to be available for resiliency, and through both FEMA and the Senate implementation through various sources for resiliency, and we just don't have the resource to be able to manage some of that new money that's coming in. So it's a point well taken. I also like Ron's point about parking lot retrofits. We've often focused on public properties and low-hanging fruit, but being able to get after some of the private lots and address those as kind of in cooperation with their MS4 and commercial stormwater permits. That's a goal that we need to strengthen. And you guys have done a great job with the urban, suburban, impervious cover best management practices and policy recommendations to reduce pollutant loads. EPA often asks us when we come up with these watershed plans, if we implement all the recommendations of the watershed-based plan, will we achieve restoration of the water body to meet water quality standards? And I have a specific comment. I'm curious about managing agricultural runoff, specifically controlling sediment loading, which was identified as a primary concern in some of the early scoping meetings. And can and will you provide more specific recommendations? For example, percentage number of areas to be used for row crop production should be managed with X specific practices to meet our goals, and to what extent is NRCS willing to get involved with helping to get those practices implemented?
Yeah, that's a great point, Chris. And I think we've worked with and reached out to NRCS, to try to support some of those site-specific recommendations for the agriculture, with, I guess, limited success in terms of being able to access, those site-specific or farm-specific information, at that level to, quantify, what practices make sense on specific sites, or, how much load reduction you could get by implementing, X, Y, and Z conservation practices in, certain watersheds. So that's been one of the challenges that we've had is not having, that information readily accessible to us, at that level of detail, quite honestly. And so, we've tried to keep the recommendations somewhat higher level and more general when it comes to the agricultural conservation practices and some of the farmland preservation recommendations. And I don't know if there's anything else to add, Chris, in terms of that topic, but I know it's been tough to get the detail that we would like to know on certain properties, what makes the most sense.
Yeah, Eric, I'll just chime in. I know
Yep.
that we've had conversations about that, and there was also some concerns about finger pointing at a specific farm, right? And so trying to avoid specifically naming a location in the plan was something that was discussed as the plan was being developed. I mean, having the broader recommendations allows the appropriate opportunities to be used on a farm when you get to that project specific or site specific planning phase, working with a specific farmer or producer. So I think that's the direction that the plan has gone, and some of the reasoning why, in addition to what Eric responded with.
Yeah, that's a good response, but I think at a high level, we should be able to say what percentage of areas used for row crop production should be managed with specific practices. Without identifying those specific farms, we can say there are X number of acres and we need to manage this many to meet our water quality goals.
Yeah.
And then get the money from NRCS or other sources that help the farmers to implement those. Because I think that's where we started with Javier in the beginning, was we really need to be able to assist the producers and help them to maintain, water quality goals. So I'm hoping that this process can meld well with NRCS to be able to actually get those implemented goals.
Yep, I hear where you're coming from, Chris. I think it's a good point.
Yeah, I would agree. Chris, did you have anything else?
I think that's enough. I mean, take the recommendations that Jamie gave us to heart too, and Ron's, and I think, yeah, we're doing well with this. Great job. Thanks.
Okay, there's a couple more things that have come into the chat that I'll read for folks. There's a comment about the town-owned ag land in North Branford being a good potential site for denitrifying wood chip bioreactor, and that Public Works could install and inexpensively install such a installation. I don't know if Eric or Michael, if you have any experience with that sort of work or would comment on that directly.
Yeah, I don't have expertise in that with those practices, but I mean, I'm sure we could potentially incorporate that recommendation. I mean, what we try to do is, kind of list some of the more common agricultural conservation practices, and there's no reason that we can't include, some of the, I guess, more innovative, newer techniques, within the list, and maybe even, point to a site or an area, that might benefit from those. That's my initial thought, at least.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Yeah, I think especially if we're identifying high nitrogen loads from fertilizers, there's not as much animal agriculture here as there might be in some of the districts up in the Eastern Conservation District. But if we identify that those nitrogen loads are excessive, then we definitely should consider it. Otherwise, some of the more traditional BMPs might function,
Right.
Remove sediment.
Yep. I think that makes sense, because the right solution for the right water quality issue and the right land use. Next thing in the chat box was Chris Malik just promoting that the district website has a lot of watershed protection materials published on the site. So for Susan asking about those, there might be some brochures or other documents there that could be used. And then Victor, the engineer in North Brantford, commented that the Stormwater Collaborative in East Lyme, he was active in that group. So having you in North Brantford will be a great resource as we move forward with this plan. That is
Absolutely.
that's all I've got in the chat box. If anybody else has anything that they would like to add, raise your hand or unmute yourself and speak up. There's still a little bit more, Eric and Michael, or is this the end of the show?
I think there was just one last slide.
Okay, that's kind of what I thought.
That's just to direct people to comments. So
That's the most important part.
that's right.
Can't forget that.
Yeah. So the slide that Michael just shared, it shows on our website, the Southwest Conservation District website, we've posted the materials from the chapters that have been published for the draft document. And there's actually some Word files that are basically tables that are set up for each of the sections of the document. And we're just asking for people to put their written comments directly into those Word files under the appropriate section, so that it's easier for us to catalog all the comments as they come in. And then we can send one grouped file to Michael so he can make the changes that are suggested to the document before we finalize it. And you could submit those files to the email address that's on the screen, the swcd@conservect.org. And this graphic that's on the screen, it's an accordion file. So you click on the little arrow where the pink hand or blue hand icon is clicking, and there's a bunch of files underneath there. And Melissa has just shared it in the chat box as well as the link. And Susan, I can connect with you offline for some of the publications that we have on our website that might be the most useful. Does anybody have anything else that they would like to add or speak up to? We are trying to get comments by Monday so that we can get everything to Fuss and O'Neill and they can make the changes before the end of the month when we're going to submit the final document to NRCS.
Just say that this is a great watershed plan, guys. It's really an amazing suite of projects. So thanks for all the work that went into it, Eric and Michael and Chris and Melissa too.
Thanks, Nicole. Well, you did a good part of it too.
Yeah, I was going to say, you were part of that big time. Thank you. I would just like to say, I'm sorry we couldn't meet in person. There are several of you that I know, and it would have been great to meet in person, but this could be worse.
Yeah. And I'll just chime in with one thing that related to the Farm River plan. I feel like I missed an opportunity, but from the stream walks that we did, we actually found a location in East Haven where there could be some like a greenway developed, and we've actually gotten funding to start doing that sort of planning work with the district and working with Fuss and O'Neill to do those designs. And so if folks that are on this call are interested in being involved in some of the outreach efforts or that design work, you can certainly connect with me via email, and we can start building up those efforts to get the Greenway Trail designed in East Haven. It's about 1.25 miles of the Farm River right on the riverbank, so it's a really good opportunity for us to already start moving forward with implementations within the watershed. So definitely connect with me if you're interested in that. Anybody have anything else? All right. Well, I appreciate everybody coming, all the questions and feedback, and definitely look forward to reading all your written suggestions and getting those off to Eric and Michael to finalize this document. And once the plan's finalized, we'll probably send it out to the same list of people that got the invitations for this event and have been going to the stakeholder meetings and other groups in the watershed as well. So if there's nothing else, I think that's probably the end of our meeting, and people can go off and have dinner.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks,
everybody.
Eric. Thanks, Chris. Thank Mike.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, thank you guys.